Well, good morning. I told Shane that I didn't watch his message until Saturday. And the reason for that was that so often when somebody else speaks and I watch the message, then I think, oh, he should have said this, or he should have said that, or he could have put that in there. And then I find myself putting together this disjointed message that has nothing to do with what God's trying to give me to say. So I put my message together first, and then I watched it. And, what he was talking about with being judgmental or not being judgmental. There are things that we are required to judge in the scriptures. We're supposed to, like somebody like me who's speaking, you're supposed to judge whether what I'm saying is right or wrong. Okay? But then there's the negative kind of judgment that's easy to do sometimes. I mean, if you look at some of the people that I run into, that I get to deal with, like Jen, and I look at her and, oh my gosh, she's such a mess, And it would be easy to be very judgmental on her and some of the things that she says, but that wouldn't accomplish anything. What would it gain? It wouldn't gain me anything with her, that's for sure. So there's everything can be good, or it might not be good. Everything has to be looked at through the lens, I think, of what I would call it, the lens of Jesus Christ. And that's how we have to look at things. I ask myself that a lot, and sometimes people ask me that too. What would Jesus do in this situation? And I did have one guy who had Bobby had invited him to stay, and he was off the street, and Bobby was trying to get him up and get him to leave, and he wouldn't do it. And so I went in and I told him, you can't stay here. You've got to leave. And he said, no, I don't have to. I can stay here if I want to. I thought, well, that's kind of an odd response. And I said, no, not really. You're going to have to leave. And he looks at me and he goes, well, what would Jesus do? And I told him, I said, well, I'm not really sure what Jesus would do, but you still have to leave. And then he threatened to beat me up. And so I walked outside and just pulled up my cell phone, called the APD to come and get this guy out of the building. And but in the meantime, he sees what I'm doing. In the meantime, he heads out the back door and he goes across the street. And I'm standing out here, and he starts just yelling all kinds of foul language and stuff, and it's just going on and on. And I listened for a little while, and then I hollered at him when I got a kind of a break in it a little bit. I guess he needed to take a breath. I hollered at him. I said, "Is that what Jesus would do?" And then he was quiet after that because he obviously knew, No, of course not. Well, we're looking at Acts, the end part of Acts 17 and the beginning part of Acts 18. And it really contains two stories. And one of them is about Paul in Athens. The other one is about Paul in Corinth. Okay? And they could not be different places, probably. Athens was like the intellectual capital of the Roman world, This is where they had the Areopagus, I think is what it was called, yeah. Which is like a room where, it probably resembled like a large college classroom that's kind of set up at an angle and people sitting around it. And the Stoics and the Epicureans and different philosophers would come and speak, and people would come to listen to them. And it was like a teaching center. And of course, Paul wanders through Athens and he sees all of these little shrines to these different idols that they were worshiping. But it talks about how Paul was kind of like vexed in his heart, but he doesn't show it when he starts talking to them. He tells them that he perceives that they're very religious. And that's a positive way of putting all that idol worship, huh? He perceives that they're very religious, yeah. And then he goes on and he says, you even have a shrine to the unknown God. I mean, they were so religious that just in case they left somebody out, they created this shrine for the one they don't know about. Oh, man. And so he says, it is he that I have come to tell you about. Obviously, the one you don't know about. Oh, it was good. And so he speaks to them, but at Athens, he doesn't have much success. It does talk about a few people that latched on to what he was saying, but not very many. And if you read through the Bible, you never find the church at Athens. It's not there. Okay? Whereas most of the other places that Paul went, there was a church. Perhaps this is what Paul had in mind when he speaks of people who were always learning but never able to come to the knowledge of the truth. You know, the problem that I have with that verse is it applies to us as well. It can apply to us as believers. Always learning, but never able to really figure out what the truth is. Have you ever heard the term intellectual idiot? It's really a contradiction of terms, okay? Or educated idiot. Some people use that term. I've heard it. I've met some people that kind of fit that category, okay? I mean, they're extremely well educated. I have a guy that I know that has 5 or 6 degrees, but he can't communicate. I mean, you read what he says, like on a Facebook page, and I go, I wonder what he just said. I wonder what he's trying to say. And usually I have to ask him, and then he'll give me a little insight, but even the insight, I can't figure out what he's saying. My father, when I was growing up, was a very uneducated man. He never finished high school, dropped out of high school, lied about his age, joined the army right at the end of the Second World War. And a lot of kids did that, okay? And, but my father had something that is really missing in so many people today. He had common sense. He could figure things out. He knew how to think. He could have been a very well-educated person, I think. I learned a lot from him. A lot more than I learned from some of the teachers that I had down through the years. So this term, though, like intellectual idiot or whatever, is kind of it's a terrible term. It kind of contradicts itself. But what it's depicting is somebody that's very well educated, but really doesn't have any common sense. If you look up the term idiot, it is somebody who is born with a mental defect, or it is somebody who becomes mentally deficient from like an accident or something like that, okay? It really doesn't have anything to do with how well educated they are. A well-educated person can be in an accident but what you had at Athens was these people who just constantly, they were insatiable. They wanted to know more. They wanted to hear more. Anything that was different that came, boy, they'd bring them into the Areopagus and they would speak and it was an insatiable appetite for more knowledge. In 2 Timothy 3, 1-7, Paul writes this. He says, "But know this, that in the last days perilous times will come." Well, look around. Are we in the last days? Yes, we are. I can tell you that. You know how I can tell you that? Because Peter's first message, when they were speaking in tongues and all of that, what does he say? He says, this is what the prophet Joel said. In the last days, I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. Peter says, what's happening was what the prophet Joel said would happen in the last days. So we've been in the last days for about 2,000 years now. Okay? So whenever anybody asks me, do you think we're in the last days? I always say, yep, no doubt about it. I can show you. Obviously, I think Paul is talking about something more than that here. Talking about literally the way things will be at the end. Jesus said that it would be like in the days of Noah. Okay? Every man's doing what is right in his own eyes, whether it's right or not. Scary thought. But he goes on, he says in 2 Timothy, he says, "But know this, in the last days perilous times will come. For men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, unloving, unforgiving, slanderers, without self-control, brutal, despisers of good, traitors, headstrong, haughty, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying its power." And then Paul says this, "And from such people turn away." Well, that is not a very flattering description. Wow. But it does describe a lot of what I see going on in our society today. Without self-control. I read about the guy who got cut off in traffic. And he follows the person home that cut him off in traffic, and he shot him and killed him. And I want to figure out where this guy is incarcerated. And I want to go pay him a visit. And I just want to ask one simple question. Was it worth it? Now you're going to spend the rest of your life in a terrible place with terrible people. Was it worth it? How could it be? You know, stuff like that just amazes me that people don't think beyond an instant into the future, what this is going to bring into their life. Without self-control, brutal, despisers of good, on and on. And if you go down just a few verses in 2 Timothy, Paul says this. This is where he says, always learning and never able to come to the knowledge of the truth. Always learning and never able to come to the knowledge of the truth. Truth doesn't matter much anymore. I'm convinced of it. It just doesn't seem to matter to people anymore. I mean, you can point out that something is simply not true, and it doesn't matter. A friend of mine on Facebook pointed out something and did a search and tried to verify something and pointed out that what had been said was not true. And she was accused by somebody else commented on her page, why are you spreading this propaganda? No, wait, it was true. It's truth. It's not propaganda. Propaganda, what? But you see, if it doesn't fit that person's way of thinking, then it's propaganda, even if it's true. Doesn't matter. This is a problem that we have in this day and age, is that we have redefined words. When you're talking to somebody out there on the street, a lot of times you have to think about, what does that word mean to them? Because it doesn't mean what Webster's dictionary says it means half the time. Some of the people that Paul describes there are just simple folks who are not necessarily well educated, but always learning. Always learning seems to indicate that others were well educated. But look at what Paul says to the Corinthians, because that's where Paul goes next after he gets done at Athens. In 1 Corinthians 1:26, it says, brothers and sisters, think of what you were when you were called. Okay, what that means is think back to what you were before you decided to follow Christ. Okay? Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were influential. Not many of noble birth. No, those people, they were in Athens. They were not in Corinth. And in 1 Corinthians 1:20 it says, where is the wise man? Where is the scribe? Where is the philosopher of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? Yeah, he sure has. Now bear in mind there's two kinds of wisdom spoken of in the scriptures. There's godly wisdom and human wisdom, or wisdom of the world. As Paul puts it this way when he's speaking to the Romans, he says in Romans 1:21 and 22, he says, for although they knew God, they neither glorified him nor gave thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking and darkened in their foolish hearts. And although they claimed to be wise, they became fools. They claimed to be wise, they became fools. You know, all I have to do to be convinced that there is a God, there is a creator, is look out the back window and see that forest out there. Or look around here and see you guys in here. I mean, it's not hard. Shane talked about it last week. He talked about special revelation and general revelation. Special revelation being what we see from the scriptures. General revelation is what we see in the world. Kind of like the verse that says, the heavens declare the glory of God. And boy, do they. When it's a clear night and you look out there and you see all those stars, yeah, they declare the glory of God. Everything does. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God. Now notice it says they knew him. Wow. But they didn't glorify him, nor did they give thanks to him. They became futile in their thinking. They claimed to be wise. This is what I call intellectual pride. This is pride in your education. It's like the fellow who was in a philosophy class at Humboldt State University many years ago. And I'm sure the professor in the philosophy class had a very good education. He was very well educated. But he starts off his philosophy class by asking the question, have you ever seen God? Have you ever heard God? He goes through the 5 senses. And when he gets to the end of it, he says, and I submit to you there is no God. What a dumb statement. Because you can't see something with your own eyes or your own ears, it doesn't exist? How stupid. Well, one of the kids in my college class got up and he asked, he says, "Can I address that?" And the professor said, "Sure, go ahead." And he stands up and he goes, "Have you ever seen the professor's brain? Have you ever heard the professor's brain?" And he goes through the 5 senses and he says, "Then I submit to you, the professor has no brain." And he sat down. I don't think he did real well in that class. But he made his point. You can have a great education, but you don't need to take pride in it. You don't need to put confidence in it. There's nothing wrong with getting a good education. But some, like my father, who was very uneducated, was really an incredibly intelligent man. And I never appreciated that until later in life. Where I first learned to appreciate that, I was installing 2 lights in a place that I'd made to be like a study in my house. 1 light on either side. Wired it all in, turned it on. 1 bulb was on and 1 was off. So I turned the switch the other way. The other bulb came on and this one came off. I rewired it 3 or 4 times and could not get it to work. And so I called my dad. He drove 80 miles and it took him 3 minutes to fix it. That's when I learned to appreciate my father. Brothers and sisters, think of what you were when you were called. Not many wise, not many influential, not many of noble birth. You can even become prideful over your knowledge of the Bible. And that kind of pride is no better than the worldly wisdom pride. Paul gives the Colossians a warning about these things in Colossians 2:8. And he says this, he says, "See to it that no one takes you captive through philosophy and empty deception, according to the tradition of men, according to the elementary principles of the world, rather than according to Christ." Notice the contrast. The world and Christ. The world and Christ. There is philosophy or there's empty deception that is according to worldly wisdom or traditions of men. There is wisdom and there is a philosophy that is according to Christ. They're not the same. I don't know if I want to finish this or go into this next section. This next section is pretty long. The only thing I really want to say this morning is that it's so easy to get prideful. There's a couple that's usually here in church on Sunday morning, and they left another church because they talked to the pastor about something he had said, and instead of clarifying what he had said, the pastor just brushed them off and wouldn't pay any attention to what they were saying. And they left that church because of that. There's always opportunities for God to humble us. One of the youngest people that attends our church one morning came up to me and confronted me about something I had said that was not accurate. And I mean, this was a kid that's like, at that time, 11, 12 years old, something like that. And she was right. Now, she misunderstood what I said, or I just didn't say it well, either way you look at it. But boy, I was impressed with that. See, I've packed a lot of knowledge into this head. But I can't rely on that. I can't rely on my intellect. I can't rely on my way of thinking. I have to go back to the Word. And this is why I've always said, what I'm going to do here is do the best I can to give you the truth. And then I hope you do something with it. There's a certain humility that is required to acquire godly wisdom. First of all, you have to admit that necessarily what you're thinking and what you have is not necessarily godly wisdom. You have to be humble enough to receive from God what he wants to give you. The folks in Athens, for the most part, couldn't do that. But Paul had much greater success at Corinth. Much greater success. But I think we'll save that for next week. What we're looking at today with Paul at Athens and Paul at Corinth is we were looking at the difference between intellectualism that he found at Athens and the sensual, sexual stuff that he ran into at Corinth. I want to go into that just a little bit before we break this off and go. I want to talk about where Paul goes next, because he goes to Corinth, and I want to look at a little bit of the history of that. It's about 50 miles west of Athens. And when Paul visited it, it was the capital of the Roman province of Greece. Not Athens. It was a center of commerce and trade. It was the Greeks had built this skidway between the Adriatic Sea and the Aegean Sea, where they actually pulled the boats across the land from one sea to the other. It was pretty amazing. It was also the center of the worship of Aphrodite, one of the gods or goddesses of that day. Aphrodite was the goddess of sex. Okay, and there was this huge temple of Aphrodite on the hill in the back of the city, and you can still see what's left standing of it there in Corinth. You can go to Google and it'll bring you up a picture. I think Google has a picture of everything. Every evening, about 1,000 priestesses from the temple would come down into the city streets and ply their trade, indulging in the worship of sex. This was normal. This was normal in Corinth. Wow. And Paul was upset with them in Athens. Wow. Corinth had gained a reputation throughout the whole Roman world as the center of sensuality. And this is the city that the apostle came to. In other words, it was probably like a lot of cities here in California. Really not much different. We look back in the past and we go, wow, that was ridiculous. But take a look at what's going on in some of our cities here in California. I mean, in the United States of America, where is the capital of pornography? Los Angeles. That is the capital of pornography. And why is that different from this? Not really. No different. Corinth was infested with strongholds of evil, which the apostle describes in his first letter to the Corinthians. And that's where we're going to go. We're going to take a look at that. Places where evil was entrenched and was difficult to dislodge. Yeah, it was difficult to dislodge. He actually talks to the church in 1 Corinthians and is sharing with them that they shouldn't be indulging themselves with the prostitutes. He's not saying this to the average person living in Corinth. He's writing that to the church. Wow. You think these guys didn't quite get it? But we'll look into some of that later. You know, Corinth was very much like our own cities in many ways. And you could almost refer to Paul's letters to the church at Corinth as his first and second letters to the Californians, or maybe more accurately, the Americans. A lot of things. A lot of things. But I think we'll pick it up next week. Let's see. I don't need that. I do need that. Got all kinds of stuff that I printed out here that I don't really need. So kind of, I want to do something for next week. It would be better if there were more people here, but that's okay. I want to ask you two questions, and I want you to try to tell me the answer to these two questions next week. Okay? Are you ready? Two questions. Okay? First question. When did the 12 followers of Jesus that Jesus picked, when did they start believing that he was the Messiah, that he was the Son of God? When did they start believing? Jesus' ministry lasted about 3.5 years. Somewhere in that 3.5 years, they started believing. What I want to hear is, when do you think that happened? Okay? Second question. When did Jesus begin discipling them? Before or after that time? Think about it. Yeah, I want to see how many people will attempt to answer those questions when we come back next week. But right now, I want to do something that we haven't done in a long time. Okay? I put together communion this morning. You will notice there's some over here and there's some over here. This is distancing communion. Okay? And we're going to do this differently. We're going to do it as individual families necessarily, or as individuals. Okay? We're not necessarily going to partake all together. The thing I want to say to you about this is, what is this? What are we doing? In 1 Corinthians 11, again back in 1 Corinthians, the Corinthians had some problems with this. So Paul tries to straighten them out. And Paul says this, "For I received from the Lord that which I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the same night he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, 'Take, eat, this is my body which is broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' And in the same manner he also took the cup after supper, saying, 'This cup is the new covenant in my blood. This do as often as you drink it in remembrance of me.'" He set this up to be a memorial for himself, what he had done. "For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." You proclaim the Lord's death, that Jesus died. Then he goes on and he says, "Therefore, whoever eats this bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of the body and blood of the Lord." Woof. Man, you don't want to go there. What makes us worthy? Only the fact that by faith we've come to believe that Jesus is who he says he is, and to believe that Jesus came back from the dead. If you don't believe, you should not partake in this. Okay, because Paul goes on to say, for he who eats and drinks in an unworthy manner eats and drinks judgment to himself, not discerning the Lord's body. For this reason many are weak and sick among you, and many sleep. He's not talking about taking a nap. He's talking about are dead. This is serious. If we would judge ourselves, we would not be judged. But when we are judged, we are chastened by the Lord, that we may not be condemned with the world. So what I want you to do is, keeping a distance between you and the next person, is we're just going to take a few minutes. We're going to have some music playing. And I want you to come up and get the elements and go ahead and partake of them. Okay? And I'll start. And we'll do this as families, if there's a family. If you're individual, then, you're on your own. So, my dear, come on up.